Hitman 2-3, this is Hitman 2. What's the status? Over. 2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er, 119er. Break.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest today is Major John Nelson Rickard, who is a member of the Canadian Forces, and he's currently on the faculty of the Canadian Army Command and Staff College. So, John, welcome.
Oh, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited to have you on today. As we were talking a little bit before we started the recording, the podcast has been focused sort of on airborne operations with an emphasis on World War II. And for those of y'all, none of you know, but I was actually, when I was in grad school, Professor Rickard was one of my instructors talking about strategy, tactics, and operational art. And he's the right guy to come on and talk about the Second World War. He's an expert in patent, a multitude of other disciplines. But one of the things I really want to talk about today is the Canadian forces in World War II. The Commonwealth forces made up a large part of the Allied combat power, but they don't get a lot of press, especially in the United States. We tend to have a feeling that we really swooped in and saved democracy all on our own. And we really need to come to grips with the fact that a world war did require a world effort. And the Canadians punched way above their weight, in my opinion. And I really want to try to get to that today. So with the start of that, Canada is kind of an interesting political development during the 20th century, going from being literally a colony of Britain to gaining dominion status and then ultimately becoming an independent country. And I'll admit that what I know about Canadian history, I can write in a matchbook in crayon. So could you kind of explain, John, how what was called dominion status affected Canada and its obligations to Great Britain and the United Kingdom leading up to the Second World War?
Well, dominion status was just one step towards the fulfillment of self-government. In the First World War, we had no choice. When Britain declared war on Germany, that automatically meant that we were going to. 1931, the Statute of Westminster is put into effect, which gives us greater power over our foreign policy. And we delay a week in 1939 on declaring war on Germany. But there would have been an uproar in the country had we not declared war on Germany. So that familial connection with the empire was very, very strong still in 1939. But the legal parameters were being put in place for us to become fully independent.
Understood. So when you talk about those ties to the empire, I mean, we're only talking roughly 20 years after the end of the First World War, which again, there had been a very large Canadian commitment. So I imagine that level of patriotism, and I don't want to say antagonism towards Germany per se, but memories are long, and the First World War was in living memory. That must have fed at least the rhetoric on the road to war in 1939.
No question. There was a long-standing assumption in Canada that when Britain was at war, Canada was at war. And went back to the Boer War and even before that. So in 1939, had the country not declared war on Germany, there may have been a mass migration of English-speaking Canadians, particularly to the mother country at that point. To serve in various capacities, maybe join the Royal Navy, the RAF, but certainly there was a powerful impetus to go and support the larger idea of the empire and basically to defend the smaller idea of England itself, because there were so many connections.
Understood. Now, the interesting thing about Canada is you've got land mass larger than the United States. You've got two oceans, but you've got a relatively small population. Like even today, the population of Canada is roughly the size of the population of California. So how did Canada make its strategic decisions basically as it raised forces? How are we going to deal with defending the homeland versus coming up with an expeditionary capability to serve on foreign service? Was that thought through, or how did they approach that?
It was thought through, but the casualty rate in the First World War was a strong, powerful memory. And our Prime Minister at the time, Mackenzie King, was loath to send another expeditionary force overseas because we had lost 60,000 killed in the First World War in fielding a corps. So Mackenzie King, his main effort really was to support the British Commonwealth Air Training Program. homeland defense, as we would call it now, and the naval aspects. He did not want to see a large Canadian army overseas. And that developed over time as the threat changed in Europe. After the fall of France, everything changed. And the country of 11 million people would eventually have to put 500,000 troops into the field in all branches, logistics, engineers, put 5 divisions in the field, 2 separate brigades, plus support a massive air effort. It was a weighty contribution per capita to the war effort, but the country was capable of doing it and sustaining it, even though there were some hiccups, as we all had hiccups with manpower issues due to casualties. But we were capable of seeing it through to the end.
So when you talk about mobilization on that scale, you say, a country of 11 million people raised almost 500,000 in uniform. And of course, there's going to be supporting labor and supporting, home front efforts to be able to do that. Was there an emphasis on a particular theater, or was the focus worldwide as this was a global war? The little I know about Canadian forces, I know what happened at Dieppe. I know they participated in the D-Day landings, but were Canadian forces represented in each theater, or was there really focus on Europe?
No, it develops awkwardly. In the First World War, we were in very quickly on the Western Front because we didn't get pushed off the continent. In the Second World War, we sent 1st Division to France, and after the fall of France, we fell back to England and garrisoned England for several years. So we had no place to fight. And we were looking for places to fight, and the government was looking for places to commit us for morale and spirit. And one of the worst decisions probably was the decision to send 2 battalions to reinforce Hong Kong, which of course fell in around December 1941. As you're being attacked in Pearl Harbor, we lose 2 battalions in Hong Kong that go into captivity for the rest of the war. That was a one-of. Well, we don't venture back into to the Far East again until the very end of the war, when we had considered putting a division into the field to support the invasion of Japan.
Interesting. Now, at that time in 1941, where we're talking 2 battalions, that was probably before full mobilization, for lack of a better term. So that must have been a significant amount of combat power at the time to lose that many troops.
It's about 1,800 troops that we lose, including the brigade staff and all those ancillary troops. A heavy blow. Obviously, it created an investigation, a royal commission, as we would say, to investigate the causes of the debacle out there in the Far East. But yes, we are mobilizing as fast as we can. We get the 1st Division overseas early in 1940, and eventually grow to a corps by the end of 1940. But the Canadian Army establishment is fairly well defined, and we're stood up to the Army program of those divisions and separate brigades. It's all finished by the end of 1942, early 1943.
So with that buildup and is focused in England. So obviously going back across the channel, getting back onto the continent is not only an Allied goal, but obviously it's going to be a Canadian goal. Now, if I mentioned to you before the recording, I wanted to talk a little bit about the raid on Dieppe and Canadian participation, since Canadian forces made up the bulk of the combat power for that operation. So could you kind of set the stage for Dieppe and let folks know what happened?
Dieppe is shrouded in controversy from top to bottom and every possible angle. You have to remember, in August 1942, the Germans are at the gates of Stalingrad, and we have yet to basically play any significant role in the fighting. The British are fully engaged in North Africa. You're on the verge of you're planning for Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa. And the Canadian Army's been sitting there for a couple of years. So the pressure to do something is pretty intense. And this sort of combined with a multitude of different lines of effort, whether it's looking for ultra intelligence and trying to capture Enigma machines, or whether it's to bring on an air battle to trick the Luftwaffe, or to test German defenses on the coast. These things all conspire to pull us in, but primarily because we needed to be seen to be doing something. Tremendous pressure on the Army commander and General McNaughton to get something done, to take part in the raiding program that Lord Mountbatten had been pushing heavily. So we volunteered for it. And of course, it originally was called Operation Rudder, but was canceled. And Montgomery said, thank God, because it was a bad plan. But it gets rejuvenated a month later as Operation Jubilee, and in we go in August 42 into a really bad tactical situation. And the argument continues about what the actual purpose was. But in terms of lessons, whatever we want to say, we decided not to attack ports directly after Dieppe. So the Yanks don't attack Cherbourg directly. You take it from the rear. And we land on the open beaches on D-Day rather than trying to attack the ports, even though we want the ports. All of Brittany, the whole Brittany Peninsula is full of ports that the planners wanted for logistical reasons. But a tremendous blow, cripples 2nd Canadian Division for a long time. And there's even some legacy aspects of it in Normandy when they come ashore. They're still a bit unsteady. When you lose 2/3 of your strength in that way, there's some lasting psychology that's hard to dissipate.
No, understood. And I want to explore a little bit more, because it's kind of fascinating when you lay that out, that it's even today where historians are still discussing what were the true objectives. So it almost sounds like it was a solution in search of a problem. We've got trained manpower sitting in England. We want to be able to show a contribution, and I totally understand the psychological advantages of that. But was there, I understand people talk about we were trying to get an Enigma machine to be able to break German codes. Okay, we need to develop TTPs for cross-channel invasion. But were those almost justifications after the fact? Like, yeah, I'm still trying to determine in my own mind and my own reading, other than a show of force, even that we've got an asset, let's use it. Why Dieppe was chosen, and what if it had been successful, what success would have looked like other than not sustaining 60% casualties.
Yeah, what would success look like? So we go in and take the town and hold it for a couple of days and leave. The Germans do change their behavior somewhat after the raid. And clearly they realized that they have to do more along the coast, even though we were easily repulsed at the end of the day because of the withdrawal of the naval support. McNaughton is on record. He actually, there is a piece of paper with his signature on it where he says that he understands how tough this is, but at the end of the day, the Russians need help. And that Churchill's told him the Russians need some sort of gesture that we are indeed serious about coming in from the West, right? And juxtaposed against that, of course, is the tremendous fear of the British that they're simply not ready to go. Because the Americans, of course, want to go in 1942-43,
yes, sir.
Called Operation Sledgehammer. I don't know how much of a sledgehammer it would have been. I think it would have been a tough slog with the, this is around the time of Stalingrad. Stalingrad actually hasn't happened yet. The German army hasn't culminated in the east. The Luftwaffe is not broken yet. But Dieppe did bring on a massive air battle, the largest air battle of the war over the beaches of Dieppe.
Oh, wow.
So when you do investigate, that's the tricky part about the records, because the different records reveal different things and people interpret them differently. Some people will say it was all designed to bring on that air battle to attrit the Luftwaffe. That's really the only possible thing we could do beyond strategic bombing to help the Russians. Right?
Yes, sir. And that, go ahead, please finish your thought.
No, it's a microcosm of the tension between the British and the Americans about when's the right time to go.
Understood. And I think that's when you bring up the Russians and talk about it at the strategic level, that's kind of exciting to me because it shows that interplay between strategic, operational, even tactical decisions. Because you look at it in a microcosm and you can talk about tactical mistakes, attacking a port directly. You can talk about what was the operational objective. We really don't know it, but that's a perfectly valid strategic objective when you have an ally that's getting hammered by a very powerful enemy and you don't appear to be making a contribution. Making that show of force actually is a very valid strategic objective. So that when you expand that aperture, that's a very, the fact that General McNaughton signed that statement that the Russians need something, that makes sense to me. Now it's hard to justify that to a family that's lost a trooper, but at the same time, when you're talking about a global war and strategic decisions, that's perfectly valid.
It's a wicked problem because North Africa only consumes so much German combat power. Not much at all at the end of the day.
Yes, sir.
So what can you possibly do? And when you look at the number of and all the staff officers watching will appreciate this. Again, the amount of staff effort that went into planning crazy operations. We were trying to get into operations everywhere, and McNaughton established this policy that it had to be a legitimate operation of war. It had to have some degree of feasibility, but we were planning to attack the aerodromes in Norway. We were planning to take the Azores Islands, and some of them were pretty high risk. And you have to ask yourself, well, you can just imagine that the tension in the strategic staffs as they try to figure out how do we actually help the Russians.
Yes, sir. Now I would like to talk a little bit more, deviate from the questions we kind of laid out, because we've mentioned General McNaughton a few times. The book is displayed behind you, and most of my listeners, I didn't know who General McNaughton was before I started researching to get ready for this conversation. And he seems like a really fascinating guy. He's like a Renaissance man, if you will. He's a World War veteran. He's a professional soldier. He's a scientist. And could you just give a little bit of background to the folks watching the show about who he was and how he rose to the position he occupied at the time of the Second World War?
Andy McNaughton was considered probably one of the greatest gunners of the First World War. He commanded the heavy artillery for the Canadian Corps, takes command of the 1st Canadian Division and rises to command the 1st Canadian Army in the UK during the Second World War. He is a brilliant soldier, scientist, engineer. Unfortunately, his scientific bent got him in trouble because he was perceived to be doing those things to the detriment of command skills, not training the Canadian Army, the commanders, not mentoring and coaching them to actually apply the Montgomery technique or the Anglo-Canadian technique of warfare. And it was frustrating for him because he believed that, as well as Churchill, that many of the problems were scientific. And many Canadian soldiers at the end of the war would say, well, science would have helped us a lot in many ways in terms of anti-tank guns or a better main gun on the tank, on the Sherman tank, or longer range artillery, or better direct support communications. All these things Andy McNaughton was thinking about while he was trying to build an army from scratch, okay, to take on a peer opponent that has now had year by year tremendous combat experience, despite their losses. That corporate memory of combat was there for the Germans, and we don't have it. We are trying desperately to recreate that legacy of the First World War, when the Canadian Corps was considered an elite corps. But McNaughton runs afoul of the British, particularly the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Allenbrook, because he's perceived to be not very adept at commanding in the field. Now think about this. He gets relieved of command of 1st Canadian Army after one field exercise. He gets one shot to take the Canadian Army on exercise in England, and it's called Exercise Spartan in March 1943. And by the end of the year, he's relieved and pushed out, and Harry Currard takes over command of the army, who has no combat experience in the Second World War either. So there are as I say, the title of the book is The Politics of Command. And you as an American know this very well, how much politics are involved in command decisions at all at all levels. But it's an open debate how Andy would have actually done in command of the army in Normandy, for example. His thing that he really tried to achieve was to keep the Canadian Army concentrated. But as year by year we sit in England, he's under tremendous pressure to get parts of the army into operations. That's why the 1st Canadian Division, the old red patch, goes to Sicily under General Simmons.
Yes.
Andy thinks that it's coming back because that's what he's told, to get combat experience in Italy and come back and spearhead the invasion. But that never happens. So at the end of the day, all those formations that go in, all the units of the Canadian Army that go ashore on D-Day are all raw, including the division commander.
So this leads to a myriad of questions, and I've got 3 that I want to drive on right now. The first one being, as a scientific mind, do you think Andy kind of suffered from a prejudice against thinking officers that might have been prevalent, at least stereotypically, among UK commanders, that even the gunners are not necessarily focused on scientific solutions? It's the idea that you just have to exercise grip, you have to be seen at the head of the formation. It's let's not read too many books or think too hard about this, so let's just set a good example and march to the sound of the guns.
It's interesting because all the senior commanders in the Canadian Army are gunners or engineers, right? There are no senior infantry or cavalry commanders early in the war. They're all, even the British Army, they're mostly dominated by the gunner cabal, as they call it. But Andy was even beyond that. He understood all the technicalities of the art of gunnery and engineering. He was just above the head of the curve in terms of thinking that to tackle the Germans, you really had to be scientifically a step ahead, right? And we're scientifically a step behind in many ways on those principal platforms. The tank being the worst example. Soldiers aren't going to argue about their equipment for too long because they've got other things to do. But at the end of the day, there were complaints about the Sherman and the caliber and the horsepower and all these things that he had brought up early in the war. The nature of recce vehicles and what they should look like and what their capabilities should be. When you look back on it, go through his notes, he's right on many things, but he can't fulfill his agenda because of personality clashes with others, and it sort of leads to his downfall.
Now, was he typical for the time? He commanded during the Great War. You said he was commanded the heavy artillery for the Canadian Corps.
Right.
In the interwar years, was he rapidly promoted? Did he have a lot of command time, even though it wasn't combat command time? Or was he relatively light on experience in leading men versus more staff postings or teaching or scientific research postings?
All staff postings between the war. He is the chief of the general staff for us for several years. Sort of in the same period of time that MacArthur is the chief of staff of the army. And they both complain about the fact that they have no money or equipment to train with. Right? An incredibly frustrating time, but in Canada, we don't conduct any major massive maneuvers exercises here in Canada. There are no brigade exercises. No one in Canada knows what a brigade actually looks like on the move in Canada between the in the interwar years. So we do all our hard training and sort of relearn lost lessons in England. We don't do anything like you do with the Louisiana maneuvers. Totally different scale, of course, but we don't really attempt anything like that. So Andy, if you make a list of all the commanders that take over early in the Second World War, he's got probably the least amount of operational experience. He's got the staff training, of course, and he's got all the courses, but no chance to actually test theory.
So did Canada have a doctrine for large troop formations and employing them in the field, or did that have to be developed as the forces were raised? Because you said that he had the courses, he had the theory. So I'm assuming they at least were doing map exercises and had some ideas of what movement tables should look like, what frontages should look like. They just never had the opportunity to physically apply it.
Oh, that's correct. They have all the manuals from the War Office. They're not Canadian generated material. It's not our own doctrine. It's all from the Field Service Regulations, Volume 3, Higher Operations. That's the Bible for us, and the training at the Imperial Defense College in Cambridge, for example. But we literally have to relearn a lot of lost lessons and relearn lost lessons, vet what's no longer appropriate from the Canadian Corps, right?
Yes, sir.
Keep what's useful. Do critical analysis about what the Germans are actually doing, and then try to come up with a way to combat it. And when you study the doctrinal confusion early in the war, you really see the monkey wrench the Germans threw into the whole doctrinal development process with the early Blitzkrieg successes, because we drew a lot of wrong lessons. And probably the worst one we drew was the idea that we needed to decentralize division artillery and break up divisions into brigade groups. And that didn't work out very well in the desert.
Not at all. The penny packets that as they called them.
Yes, it seemed that Rommel always arrived with the Africa Corps to overrun one brigade, and one brigade was continually trying to attack the Africa Corps. So it's the confusion was rife. It was everywhere doctrinally, and it really took someone like Montgomery to come in and say, "Hey, we can't be doing this anymore. Re-centralize the guns," right? But these are the kind of things that McNaughton knew and argued against early in the war. So he's right about many things, as I said before.
Now, one follow-on question I have that drives from what we're talking about, doctrinal issues and staff training. As the Canadian Army expanded, I'm assuming that you did not have a large enough core of staff trained officers, guys who've been to Camberley, or I don't know if they had correspondence back then, but you had a relatively small army, you expand rather quickly. How did staff training keep up with it? Were they able to increase input of officers through special courses, or was it just done on the job? Because it's not as exciting to talk about as battlefield maneuver, but at the same time, if you don't have trained staffs, then you're not going to get formations where they need to be to execute those maneuvers.
We go into the Second World War with about 40 trained staff officers.
Oh my 40. Goodness! Oh wow!
From Camberley trained staff officers, and as you can imagine, the British have to backfill us in various ways for quite a while, until we stand up the Canadian Junior War Staff Course, headed by then Colonel Guy Simmons, right? And then he leaves and goes on his stellar career to high command at a corps level. But the best way to characterize it is a massive catch-up drill. I mean, there is no other way than to beg, borrow, and steal, and have trained officers do more than they would normally do in a specific environment, if there were enough of them. So it does slow the tempo of expansion, obviously, because it becomes a question of just competence at some point. There's a lot of friction, a lot of mistakes were made in terms of training programs, officers not knowing actually how to write a training program, how to conduct training. And that was Montgomery's biggest observation, because he visited every single Canadian battalion in the Corps and in the Army in 1942. Spoke to every CO, every brigadier, and wrote assessments on every single one of them, and identified who knew what and who needed staff help, right? And you can make a recommendation that this individual would be good if he had a good brigade major, but you've got to find a good brigade major.
Yes, sir.
and it just took time. It just took time, and but by the end of it, by D-Day, we're well. I think we're well served by the staff that know the basics. They know enough to be competent enough to flatten the learning curve.
Understood. And that's a great segue, because that time from August of 42 up through the time when McNaughton is relieved into the spring of 44. Now we're getting ready to go across the channel, Operation Overlord, and then 6 June 1944 arrives, and the Canadians hit the beach. So again, very little attention is paid to them in the popular histories, in The Longest Day, very American centric, yeah. And I'm of the opinion, again, not pretending I'm an expert in Canadian operations, but y'all had a great day that day compared to what was going on Omaha Beach or almost anywhere else in the invasion beachheads, because
right.
That was a very successful landing. And could you go into that a little bit and explain to folks how that evolved?
Sure. Well, we're just 2 beaches down from you at Juno Beach. So the British 50th Division is between us, the 3rd Canadian Division, and your lads at Omaha. And you're confounded by the terrain at Omaha, and at Juno, we're confounded by the immediate counterattacks from the Panzers. So 21st Panzer Division is literally within striking distance of the beach. And we get ashore, okay, and form our brigade fortresses, as we call them. But we can't get down to our deepest objective, which is down around Carpiquet Airfield, southwest of Caen, which was part of the whole plan to sort of encircle and take Caen early on. That doesn't happen on D-Day because of lateral issues with flank protection and security, and the psychology of penetrating with your flanks wide open. Right? So it's easy to write out the order to do that until you're on the ground and realize that there's a Panzer battalion on your left flank, and you want to go punch, several miles south by yourself, a single brigade. So we don't take Caen on D-Day, but we do hold the vital ground. All the analysis told us that the Germans were going to mass panzers and try to push us back into the beach in that area. That's why 3rd Canadian Division is heavily reinforced with anti-tank guns, and basically twice the allotment of artillery. There's the entire division artillery of 3rd Canadian Division, 13, 14, and 15 field regiments, but were augmented by even more powerful 19th Field self-propelled guns that will allow us to hold off the Germans as they counterattack in that vital corridor, that ground. It really takes terrain analysis to understand it, but it's a pretty vulnerable area for both. If they can't hold it, we could sweep down and get into good position on the high ground down around Hill 112 and Borgovus Ridge and Barriers Ridge, which will take us almost 2 months to take at the end of it. But we get ashore, we do our job, and dig in, and then it becomes a slow battle of attrition, because this idea of maneuver warfare enthusiasts despise the Second World War for some reason, but very quickly it becomes a wall of corps. You're not conducting independent operations like Stonewall Jackson in the Valley. You're not doing that. Everybody's lined up, and the Germans create that wall very, very quickly. And we're tangling with 12th SS Panzer Division on D+1, and they strike us. And then we fight those guys all the way to the end of the Normandy campaign, day in, day out. But within the 48 hours, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division is tangling with 21st Panzer Division, Panzerlehr, and 12th SS Panzer Division.
That's amazing.
It's amazing.
So if I understand you correctly, even before the invasion kicked off, the terrain analysis lent itself to the understanding that there will be a counterattack against Juno, and that led to the heavy reinforcement of anti-tank weaponry and artillery. So that at least shows staff maturity of being able to conduct that kind of analysis and make an organizational decision that makes sense. Now, I've been to Normandy once. I've been very fortunate, but I've got to admit, I was an ugly American. I was very focused on Utah and Omaha. I did get over to Sword and Pegasus Bridge. My one question as an old paratrooper is, does the terrain around Juno, did it not lend itself to any kind of, pre-invasion drops such as they had on the eastern and western flanks to allow them to seize crossroads, bridgeheads, anything that could have prevented the counterattacks on the beach, similar to what you saw over at Utah? Was that just not feasible?
The planning assumptions, I think, for the airborne drops on the flanks were feasible. I think an airborne drop directly in front of us probably would have ended in disaster, because the Germans are so close. 21st Panzer Division's right there. They actually, portions of that division actually make it to the beaches.
Okay, got it.
On D-Day.
Wow.
So as good as the paratroopers are, I think it would have been a rough day.
No, absolutely no doubt. So this was not about being able to prevent, a large movement towards the beaches. That the 21st Panzer, their positions occupied that entire area. That's a level of understanding I didn't have prior to this. So
Montgomery does consider, though, as operations mature around Caen, he does consider dropping 1st Airborne Division, the Red Devils, in between two corps around Caen, south of Caen, to sort of seal the gap. And your own General Marshal, it's poorly understood by many people, the amount of planning that was done for various airborne operations that never came off for various reasons. Patton would always say they don't work because I'm already there.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. The drop zones.
But at the strategic and in the operational level, there were many plans on the books, outline plans for dropping large airborne formations to help break up the front. So it was that's an interesting aspect to it. Whether or not it would have been successful is another story. The Germans may not have been what they were in 1941 in terms of offensive skill and subtlety. By the time they face us, it's really that the whole Russian front mentality had seized them, and they were brute force, blunt, immediate counterattacks, thinking they could just sweep us back into the sea. Shock action.
Certainly.
And it had its impact, no question, at the tactical level, but they could never break us at the formation level.
It was even in defense, they're offensive minded. That's for sure. Counter is always
absolutely
is ultimate. So, and this is a great setup to my next question, because I'm assuming most of my viewers understand, broadly, we get towards the end of July 44, the breakout's achieved, Allied forces are sweeping across France throughout the summer, and kind of the Germans are on the run, and everyone's thinking the war is going to be over by Christmas. And then we get, we sweep up north, we get into Belgium and the Netherlands. Operation Market Garden takes place, another area in which popular history, everyone loves Watching a Bridge Too Far, everybody loves Cornelius Ryan, and that's very U.S. British centric operation. You got 30 Corps, you got 1st Allied Airborne Army, but the Canadians actually made some very significant contributions in the Netherlands, separate from Operation Market Garden, through the fall of 44 and the winter of 45. And I was hoping you could kind of discuss some of those operations a little bit.
Sure, we call it the long left flank. So after Normandy, we cross the Somme River, and then it's one slog after another, Boulogne, Calais, until we get to the Scheldt. And that is basically warfare underwater or on water, because everything's flooded. We're trying to conduct operations down dikes, individual dikes. We have to clear the Scheldt estuary for shipping, so we can use Antwerp. We have to clear Walcheren Island, and there are a lot of. If we did an analysis on Walcheren Island and blowing the dams today, the lawyers would probably kick you out of the room and you wouldn't even have a chance to brief it because we blow the dam, blow the dikes, and flood Walcheren to force the Germans out of there. Things get even more nasty, and casualties are still as high as they ever were for us day to day going into the fall and winter. We don't take part, obviously, in Market Garden. We're on the left flank. But as we get into the new year and after Bradley and Montgomery have successfully closed off the bulge, Monty wants to immediately take advantage of that, right? And we, 1st Canadian Army, launches Operation Veritable, this massive operation to clear the south bank of the Rhine prior to actually crossing the river. And that is an absolutely brutal ground from Nijmegen and Arnhem to the southeast through the Hochwald Forest and known as the Hochwald Gap, which we have a very bad experience with, but we actually punch our way through there. Veritable is followed by Operation Blockbuster. So it takes 2 massive set piece operations for us to clear the west bank of the Rhine in conjunction with your own 9th Army under Simpson during Operation Grenade. Once we clear that and get into the Netherlands, we realize how bad things are in the Netherlands, especially the Western Netherlands, for the civilian population. So at one point, the Canadian Army is actually conducting offensive operations and doing humanitarian operations at the same time. Everyone thinks that's a unique characteristic of stability operations or modern current operations, but that happened all the time in World War II, all the time. There are long lists of no targets, things you can't fire on or can't do. No different than today. But we launched something called Operation Faust, where we deliver probably about 1,000 tons a day in food and relief supplies, medical supplies to the starving population of the Western Netherlands in the early months in the spring of 45. It's really the place is in bad condition. The Germans have intentionally tried to destroy the economy, I think. They flood everything they possibly can. So it's a real nightmare. And at the same time, we have to still conduct operations and clear large centers like Groningen, which takes an entire Canadian division. All 9 battalions see action in trying to clear this and they conduct urban operations, major combat operations inside this urban center as you're trying to protect the population.
Now, did the Canadian Armed Forces have anything similar to military governments or civil affairs capability, or were these humanitarian operations being conducted in conjunction with combat ops and planned and resourced by the same staffs?
No, we have a civil affairs section, not as robust as that at SHAEF, for example, which was a massive organization. But we have our own structures, own capability to do that internally to the Army. Got it. Understood. Reinforced by 21st Army Group.
Certainly. So you raise an interesting point when we were talking about back with Walcheren and the Scheldt estuary, and blowing dams. And it's obvious with just the terms we're using: island, estuary, obviously a lot of water. Were those operations akin to multiple amphibious operations, or was it just pure infantry combat in wet terrain? Was it more like island hopping type campaigns to clear the Scheldt estuary in the Pacific, or was it more similar to what folks were seeing in the Bocage down in Normandy? Like at the tactical level, what was going on?
So you could sort of visualize it, the terrain as maybe like a grid or a skeleton with the bones barely protruding above the water. So mostly water, right? So we do a lot of amphibious movement, no choice, because the amount of solid ground is very little. And we call the 3rd Canadian Division informally the Water Rats.
Very cool.
Because your mission's your mission, and there it is, and all of a sudden now you're conducting your amphibosity. And it's one of the great examples of just learning on the fly and just getting the job done with whatever you have. And because there was no choice. Those approaches had to be cleared for the shipping, because Antwerp, of course, is the biggest port with the greatest tonnage potential,
Right.
and we needed that for the big final push.
I understand.
And it takes a long time.
And I was going to ask, when was Antwerp finally not only secured, but when was it actually, a usable port where you could start landing, shipping, and moving, supplies inland?
It's not fully usable until late in the fall. So we get there. We're conducting operations up there in late September, all through October, right? And then the engineers have to go in there and clear wreckage and clear the approaches, sunken ships. And the Germans were very good at demolition when they when they had the resources. But that's doctrinal, isn't it?
Understood. So I think we've done a really good job of kind of covering the evolution of Canadian land forces, from the start of the war up through 1945. I'm interested about what, if any, contributions and growth the Canadian Navy saw. Were they a major component in the Battle of the Atlantic? Did they have a major participation in support of the Normandy landings? Did they have major, operations to, clear and open up Antwerp? Were they supporting 3rd Division? What was the Canadian Navy's role in growth?
The main effort was from early on the war, right until the end. The main effort was the North Atlantic. And again, the Royal Canadian Navy starts from a pretty grim position in terms of ships, doctrine, training. And then they get thrown right into convoy duty in the brutal conditions of the North Atlantic. And the fleet grows slowly, but between 1940 and 1943, until basically the Battle of the Atlantic is won in terms of maintaining the supply line, most of our effort is devoted to close escort of those ships, merchant ships, including your own Liberty ships and everything else that you're putting on the high seas. From 1943 to the end of the war, the Canadian Navy shifts to finishing off the German U-boats, becoming hunter-killers, even as the Germans finally realize that to have any chance, they have to field a true submarine that can stay submerged for long periods of time. So this submarine sort of Canadian naval vessel race goes on in terms of capability, and we get our kills, and we play a major role. We have, by the end of the war, the 4th largest navy in the world.
That's amazing.
In terms of number of ships. But as you know very well, after the war is over, everything atrophies, and that status went away very quickly. But for the war, the fleet grew very quickly, mostly in those frigates and small escort ships. We don't field heavy cruisers like you did, for example. We don't have a ship the size of the Indianapolis or anything like that, or battleships. It's really a convoy-centric fleet. Convoy-centric fleet, and that and all but the ships. So there are some ships that do play key roles in the combined fleet that supports the massive fleet that supports DDay, and that is doing protection duty around Shelton and all the other ports. So we're there. Unfortunately, it's just one of those things that the sheer scale, no matter how big we were, you weren't going to get many lines in the history compared to the United States Navy or the Royal Navy.
Oh, certainly. But I love that term so much, though, that just Canada consistently punches above its weight, because that is a fantastic example of that right there. You got the United States Navy is trying to fight a 2-ocean war, but it's got so much combat power focused in the Pacific, and the convoys across the Atlantic were critical. And so to be able to provide that protection, the whole joke about amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. Well, logistics needs protection, and it sounds like without the Canadian Navy, that would have been a far more difficult challenge, and that's something that should probably get more attention than it does.
Well, everything sort of offsets, right? So the contribution of the Royal Canadian Navy to the escorts freed up a lot of British ships to take on the larger German surface fleet, because the British have worldwide responsibilities as well.
Certainly.
Right. I mean, they're trying to defend the empire across the whole stretch, and it's you can only imagine the challenge. I mean, it's hard to even imagine doing that again today. And shipbuilding capacity is one of those key things that is hard to. It doesn't spring up overnight, right? The industrial capacity to even create multiple frigates and escorts is a real challenge. But we got the job done, and thank God the Germans weren't ahead of the curve a bit more in terms of submarine warfare early on, because they do tremendous damage, and that's why the Battle of the Atlantic was such a fearsome struggle, so vital too.
Yes, sir. So this kind of takes us to the end of the war now, and so Canada has gone through, the war changed everything. When we're talking about geopolitics, the UN formed the start of the Cold War. What are the lasting effects on the Canadian Armed Forces coming out of the Second World War? As you've gone, you go from having the fourth largest navy, and then post demobilization begins post-war, and things are rapidly shrinking. But things are kind of changing now. Canada's moving towards independence. Canada has had global responsibilities. So how does that play out over the second half of the 20th century, and are there any lasting effects?
Well, demobilization has its immediate effects on the institutional memory of the Army. We quickly lose that ability and capacity to think and fight in terms of large scale combat, in terms of brigades and divisions and corps. Korea follows very quickly, but we only send a brigade to Korea, which was a heavy commitment at the time, considering the size of the Army post-war. But since Korea, since the 60s, probably the early 50s, I guess, with the peacekeeping in the Sinai Peninsula, we sort of took a different turn, and the government wanted them to invest heavily in peacekeeping operations. You can interpret it different ways. It's far less costly to send peacekeepers than it is to send a corps, right? To maintain a corps in theater. But there's also that sort of that niche aspect to it. How can the small Canadian forces have a strategic impact? Well, show the flag and conduct peacekeeping operations.
Certainly.
The cameras are always on you, right? Whose flag's that? Well, that's Canada, right? Psychologically, for the Army, peacekeeping has its benefits, I guess. It also has its negatives, because you can't learn major combat skills overnight. Yes, and we found when we went to Afghanistan, for example, that although it was a coin counterinsurgency environment, the reports quickly came back that, hey, some of these old skills that we lost, these basic field craft skills that are applicable to general purpose combat forces, erode so quickly that we have to pay greater attention to it. It's the size of the Army. It's not the quality of the troops. That's probably the lasting issue. Right now we could probably, with every single person in the Canadian Army, put a division in the field, but that would include everybody, maybe even the contractors. So, in terms of scale, your point about punching above our weight is something we sort of take to heart, and our Army, like all armies, though, has a hard time saying no. Exactly. Right? So the most sober staff estimate, right, could say we can't do this, but your head says, well, of course we can do it. Of course you can do it.
Never say that.
No.
So, as an armor officer, did you find it coming up in your career? I find this fascinating, that an emphasis on peacekeeping really tankers are not, you usually don't think of those guys as a peacekeeping force. It tends to go to, light infantry, military police kind of thing. Did you find
Right.
that had a lot of, there was a lot of challenges where armor formations nested from those types of responsibilities so you could focus on combat skills, or did you guys have to balance the tension between getting levies to go, support a UN operation versus being able to go to gunnery?
Balance the tension, and there has always been a focus on training for combat. Right, you can't have main battle tanks on the range shooting. That's not a peacekeeping thing. So that is always going on in the Canadian forces. We're always sort of ready for that. We call it general purpose combat capable. But we are a very flexible little army. We are capable of dismounting the tankers, and all of a sudden now they become dismounted peacekeepers. And we've done that before in the Balkans. So when you are as small as we are, flexibility is key, and we do pride ourselves on the fact that we can sort of go wherever the wind blows. What do you need us to do today? We're small, but we're not a one-trick pony.
Understood. Well, John, I'm just about at the end of our time, and I want to say thank you very much for coming on the show today. So again, this has been Ben Powers with the Commander's Voice. My guest today was Major John Nelson Rickard of the Canadian Forces. He's an instructor at the Canadian Army Command and Staff College. He's the author of the book, The Politics of Command, about General A.G.L. McNaughton. It's a fascinating book, and I've really enjoyed our discussions about World War II. And I got to admit, I learned a ton today. So thank you so much for coming on, sir.
Thanks for having me.
You have a great day.
Thank you.